Hello and welcome back to RageGamingVideos and back to Diablo 4. Today I'm finally checking out the very potent new Necromancer unique in Season 1, the Lidless Wall. This shield provides a new effect to your bonestorms, spreading out the bonestorms to multiple targets outside of yourself. They even stay after that target dies, so every time you bonestorm, you're just spreading out a bunch of them all around the place or stacking them up, which is amazing. But what's the best build to fit something like this in? I think it's an obvious choice. It's the Shadowblight build. A build dedicated to basically being in Blood Mist very consistently, leading to most of the time being immune to damage. Combine that with hefty crit and you can get impressive AoE burst while misted. This obviously synergizes with Shadowblight as a key passive super well by turning all of your abilities into some form of shadow damage, including of course Bonestorm, and suddenly with that we're spreading Shadowblight at an even higher rate, getting to 10 stacks and bursting even harder faster, thanks to Season 1 putting in the broken Barber Heart as well. Obviously our burst, like every build using Barber and general DPS, has never been higher. Thanks to Lidless Wall, we're able to spread the damage out even better in this version and be even more survivable. On that note, if you want to improve your Diablo experience with an easy way to track and follow builds, Mobalytics, today's sponsor, is a fantastic resource for exactly that. An application I've been using on and off for years for a variety of games, and it's now here in Diablo 4. It's a very easy way to follow meta builds and maximize your gameplay. Mobalytics is a completely free companion app designed to make your experience smoother in your game of choice, as a straightforward way to check builds, find guides, consider tier lists and more. Best of all, for Diablo 4 it can be easily accessed mid-game in just a moment through the in-game overlay. You just press tab plus Q and that will push the overlay out on the left, letting you find a suitable build or guide to follow along while still in-game and moving and playing. It's a very efficient way to say, when leveling, pull out the overlay and just check your guide and what to level next without really any interruption. Or check the main app itself to check extra details where there's space for the creators to explain how the build works, advise you on the gameplay loop, and even link to full video guides should you need them. All of the builds can be filtered by class and are constantly updated according to current meta. The app has a fully functional interactive Paragon board that you can follow along and move yourself to check the details of. And recently introduced, we have a full functional build planner to create and share your very own builds. The class specializations, the equipment and aspects you're running. You can go through the skill tree yourself and again with the Paragon board as much as you want. So give the app a try. It's completely free to download. Just follow the link in the description of the video so they know we sent you. A big thank you again to Mobalytics for sponsoring the channel, but now let's get back to the video. So the build. As you can see, we're calmly clearing a tier 68 in this footage, and just as before, the Shadowblight build is ultimately a very good option for pushing high tiers, and of course all the way to 100, with the original build creator Necro clearing a tier 100 as a Necromancer in the early days of D4. This variant though, with the unique, is honestly even better than that, and is super good for pushing high tier content. So let's go through the build. We'll begin as always with the skill tree, working our way from the top. We have Reap as our basic attack, just for the Acolyte's Reap, just the guaranteed corpse spawn, helping us generate more corpses for the CC and the damage. On the next tree, since there is no core ability in this build, we're just taking Hued Flesh as always, and moving on. Then we take the all-important Blood Mist and put it to 5 out of 5 to help with its cooldown reduction, of course, enhancing it and going for Ghastly Bloody Mist because we want a guaranteed way to spawn corpses every fight, and this is a great way to do so. In this build, a good chunk of our damage is also going to come from Corpse Explosion, so we're a 5 out of 5 on that, enhancing it and going for the very important Blighted Corpse Explosion to turn it into shadow damage for our Shadowblight key passive, as we'll talk about. Since we're using Corpse Explosion, we've got 1 level in Grim Harvest. We don't care about Essence at all in this build, but 3 out of 3 on Fueled by Death, of course, is going to increase our damage after we consume a corpse. On the next tree, of course, we're going to Crepify. You'll note that I've got 3 levels in this. The most important thing is just 1 level, and we dump points into it later, as I'll explain. But we enhance it and go for Abhorrent as you'd expect for the lucky hit, cooldown reset, and potential to stun. Since we'll be cursing people with the Crepify, obviously we take amplified damage to improve damage to cursed targets, and as always, Death's Embrace for the close damage improvement and damage reduction. On the next tree, we have 1 level into Corpse Tendrils, though we are getting some more levels from items. We barely ever press this button, and if we do, we're going to get basically an instant reset anyway, so there's no point putting more levels into it, but we're going to enhance it and go for Plagued to generate vulnerability in the build, of course. Next is the Shadow passives, which are very important. 3 out of 3 on Reaper's Pursuit is going to give us some nice movement speed as we deal damage with Darkness skills, which is all the time, so nice utility there. Gloom is going to improve our damage with our Shadow build, as is Terror, so these are very important to stack up to 3 out of 3. And then we take 1 point for Crippling Darkness, just to make those Darkness skills have a chance to stun, which is always nice. On the ultimate tree, obviously we're taking bonestorm and full enhancing it for the damage reduction and crit strike chance, and then as we are sacrificing, it's standalone and memento mori 3 out of 3 as you'd expect. The last point we spend is in Shadowblight for the key passive, which is the basis for a lot of our damage in this build. At this point we would have 2 points left over, and really there's no good place to put them for a nice impactful burst, so those 2 points going into Decrepify means that the enemies get slowed harder by it and slightly deal less damage, above 20% to 22% at this level. So that's why we put the points there. In regards to the Book of the Dead, it's pretty standard fare for a Shadow-Mist build. We are sacrificing Reapers to improve our Shadow damage. For Skeletal Mages, we want to improve our Vulnerable damage with the Cold Sacrifice. And then lastly, for Golem, as always, it's Iron Golem Sacrifice for the improved critical strike damage. Next up we have our Paragon, which as you can see has quite a few boards as we are entering our 5th at that point, which I will explain as we go. But from the top we have our first board. From the bottom we go around to Prime, making our way up to the node where we have Amplify. Amplify requires 40 intelligence to get the secondary effect, but it basically means cursed enemies take 10% times increased damage, which is obviously very good for the build. And having it in your starter board means it's easy to get 40 intelligence, even when you've not got the glyph to level 15 for the radius increase, so that's why we have it here. I get the intelligence as you can see through this method, then move up from the left to our first board extension, which is, as you should expect, Wither. Wither improves our shadow damage over time effects by a massive amount of damage and scales that damage even more through willpower. This was also recently buffed to be for each 40 willpower, down from I believe 50 willpower, so it's actually even better this patch. Also for a board, we have a lot of rare nodes that are really important, so this is the first board extension. It's just a really no-brainer. To begin with though, we come from the bottom of the board and go left to the rotated glyph to be near us to get to Control as soon as possible. Control is going to greatly improve the damage to slowed and stunned targets, which we'll be doing lots of in this build. I get the 40 intelligence required to get the secondary effect, like so. There are extra magic nodes that would be nice to have here, like more shadow damage, but since I'm trying to be efficient with the points I spend, these are the things I'll come back for eventually. From the glyph, we make our way up and to the right to grab Lingering Shadows and all the magic nodes around it because they're awesome. Then we'll come to the right and down to go pick up Gnawing Darkness for better damage with shadow damage over time. And again, all the magic nodes around it are awesome. Then we'll work our way up to the right, picking up Dragging Shadows for some nice damage reduction and a few of the magic nodes that benefit. Heading to the right to finally pick up Wither, the all-important legendary node. At this point, you see that I go up to another board, but that's actually board 5. I'll explain at the end. So back to where we came up from the glyph to go towards the rare nodes, we actually head left to efficiently make our way to another board extension, which is Flesh Eater. We're consuming a ton of corpses in this build, so obviously we're going to want the major damage increase this provides. We rotate the board to get to Flesh Eater first and go down to Stifle on the entry for the crit strike damage that it provides. On the way there, we'll also pick up the magic nodes since they are good, and as we pass by, come up and pick up the Flesh Eater node. From there, we'll head straight left to the actual glyph socket where we have the all-important from any builds, Exploit for the extra vulnerable damage and scaling damage when we deal damage to vulnerable targets. We're pretty cost efficient on this one because we only want the 25 dex to get it going, but I am picking up Targeted just for the perk of having it. After we do that, we make our way straight down to our next board extension, which is Scent of Death, as you should expect. Scent of Death is giving us a major damage reduction, which is very important for the survivability of all Necromancer builds. Making our way from the top then, we come straight down and to the right, pathing through Death Marked to get to the actual glyph socket, where we have Scourge. This is going to improve our shadow damage over time, and its secondary effect means we deal 10% times increased damage to those already affected by shadow damage over time effects, so doubling up on a major damage improver. It requires 25 willpower, which is very efficient to get on this board, even when we've not extended the radius of this node. From here, we'll head left and out the glyph to go pick up Scent of Death while we're here. So at this point, we could start really filling out these boards and going for all the magic nodes and rare nodes that we're missing that are very good and enhancing the current glyphs. But the truth is, this build actually benefits from a lot of different glyphs. For example, I could also be running Territorial for the damage reduction and damage improvement to close enemies. Or we could go for the even better Darkness glyph, which means when we deal shadow damage to an enemy, they deal stacking reduced damage up to 10%, which is awesome, but every 5 willpower that you enhance this glyph with actually improves your shadow damage as a whole. So this is a damage reducer and a damage increaser, a really efficient glyph. But since we get a little bit more out of Scourge, I go for that first. But for my 5th glyph socket, I am planning on going for that here. So I start to work my way up to the top of the Wither board to get to my next board extension. This board extension is Bloodbath, just because it's an efficient board to get straight to a glyph. And I will work my way up to the right, straight to that glyph, and I will socket in darkness at that point and get it active. This is a good board for it because we have +7 willpower nodes on the board. With my remaining points then, I can start to do what I just said. Go get the magic nodes that I really would like extra maximum life, and enhance my current glyphs to get more out of them, like more shadow damage over time, more vulnerable damage, which is probably a top priority, and flesh out the boards in general, like missing magic nodes like improved shadow damage. Alright, now it's time for the gear section, starting with the hearts. We'll begin with our raffle heart, which is obviously Barber. I don't need to explain this. When you crit, you're going to massively burst targets after a brief period of that damage being suppressed before it blows up in AoE. Obviously, Barber is nuts, and it's no different in this build. For the other hearts, it's pretty standard stuff as well. For my brutal heart, I'm going for the Decrepify Aura heart, meaning I permanently have Decrepify actually active. What you could do then is drop Decrepify off your bars and run maybe a core skill or something that costs essence, since we're not using that. Most likely Blight in that case. But the truth is, that's not going to do that much damage, and applying Decrepify at range is a good way to prevent incoming damage, especially when you're pushing higher tiers, whereas the Decrepify aura just permanently being on is a nice way to make sure everything near you is always effective, especially those that are spawning in while you're mid-fight. For the last heart, it's obviously Sacrilegious, so that we're auto-triggering our Corpse Tendrils and Corpse Explosions, which is just super good quality of life. Now let's talk about the gear, starting from the helmet. We're running Shielding Storm. A lot of this is centered around bonestorm, and actually the barrier gets super hefty when you're generating loads and loads of bonestorms everywhere, thanks to Lidless Wall. So there's great synergy there, and it provides a massive amount of survivability. On the chest piece, we have Explosive Mist. This means your blood mist is actually detonating corpses, which is obviously going to help with the damage, and helping reduce its cooldown as it detonates those corpses. We want to be in blood mist as much as possible, so that's very important. On the gloves, we have an offensive aspect in the form of Blood Soaked, meaning we're leaving behind a trail of shadow damage while we're in Blood Mist. The damage doesn't really matter itself, it's just to generate more stacks of Shadowblight, which matters a lot. On the legs, it's Disobedience. We don't need to explain this. Amazing defensive aspect. My boots are Penitent Greaves as always. It's one of the few ways to improve your damage on an aspect on your boots, dealing more damage to those chilled by the trail we leave behind. Further CC for control as well is very good. On our one-hand weapon then, we have a wand, which is important because it has inherent lucky hit chance, which is very important for this build, but obviously we want Blighted as an offensive aspect, majorly improving the damage we deal for 6 seconds after the Shadowblight key passive triggers on enemies 10 times. We're spreading that everywhere. This is happening all the time. It's keeping our damage nice and high. More important than that though is, as always, the Grasping Veins aspect for the major crit strike chance that it provides and the critical strike damage to those affected by the corpse tendrils that it hits. We're permanently triggering this thanks to Sacrilegious and the general gameplay loop, so we're not only getting a major damage improvement, but very important, we're getting the crit strike chance necessary to trigger Barber every time or often. So it's actually really important this is on your amulet, even with Blighted being so good. On ring 1, it's Ultimate Shadow, the aspect that turns our bonestorm to a shadow damage ability. This is obviously vital and key to the build. And the other ring is Decay, as you should expect. Each time Shadowblight key passive deals damage to enemies, it increases the next Shadowblight's damage within 10 seconds by a major amount, stacking up to 5 times. The more shadow damage you deal, the more Shadowblight. The more you Shadowblight, the more damage you deal. Get to 10 stacks, you get a massive burst, and so on. And obviously on our offhand, it's the unique that this is all centered around Lidless Wall. Now when it comes to the affixes on your gear, the most important thing you want is Lucky Hit Chance. This is going to help Decrepify reset your most important cooldowns in Blood Mist and Bonestorm. You want these active as much as possible, and Lucky Hit is going to help that. So Lucky Hit Chance on your rings is super important. You can also get extra Lucky Hit while you have a barrier active on your helmet and your amulet, so I'd suggest you try to do that, and on your gloves, as well as your weapon, which should be a wand for the inherent Lucky Hit Chance. Second to that, as always, is Crit Strike Chance. The more crits we're doing, the more Barber procs we have, so that's also really important. Followed closely by critical strike damage improvements and making sure that's hitting nice and hard. After that, I'd say vulnerable damage increases is always going to be great, and in this build we can improve our shadow damage and shadow damage over time as affixes, which is also nice. Of course, when it comes to your amulet, you're going to want to consider an offensive passive that will benefit the build. I would ideally suggest the Gloom passive as just a raw shadow damage increase that you have, but second to that could also be the Terror passive, which will improve your darkness skills to slowed or stunned targets, but overall between between the two, you'd prefer Gloom. Defensively though, it's the standard stuff of damage reduction from close and far enemies, total armor, maximum life increases is always insane, but also in this build specifically, you can reduce the damage of those currently affected by shadow damage over time, which is another nice defensive aspect in this case. Around that, looking for a bit of cooldown reduction is also beneficial. For the gems, I go for rubies since we aren't ever really being CC because we're constantly blood misting or blood misting out of CC, so maximum life is going to be the go-to gem in that case. And then for the one offensive gem we have, it's improving our critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. Obviously, when we're using a shield, it becomes a defensive like an armor, so that's maximum life ruby in that case. In regards to a gameplay guide or advice, honestly, this is super simple. Just apply Decrepify to everything, whether that's for your constant aura to those near you, or actually applying Decrepify manually to close or far enemies. Make sure it's on everyone so that you're proccing the lucky hit for the cooldown resetting and damage reduction, obviously, all the time. Other than that, it's basically blood misting constantly and applying bonestorm whenever you can. You can bonestorm before you blood mist to actively be bonestorming while completely immune in the blood mist. Obviously, your bonestorm will be spreading bonestorms everywhere, spreading Shadowblight, which is amazing. When entering a fight, just make sure to send out a reap to guarantee spawn a corpse, and then that can get a pull in with corpse tendrils to get your damage going, to trigger Barber, and so on. But you should be using blood mist as a way to deal damage offensively, walking around in circles around targets that you're trying to burst. Whenever you're out of blood mist, make sure to be spamming corpse explosion to spread that as much as possible, and also you won't be taking a damage reduction because sacrilegious won't be proccing it. And as a heads up, the build, Shadowmist build in general, does struggle with bigger health single target, but you're so tanky and your cooldowns are so good that honestly it's no issue. It just takes a little bit longer to kill the bosses compared to some other builds, but thanks to our constant iframes and bone storms with the massive damage reduction there, it's no problem at all. But there you have it. That is my Shadowmist build with the Lidless Wall unique in mind. I found this incredibly fun and incredibly chill, like super easy to play. Just pushing high tier content with not really a care in the world. Even with the Bone Spear build, you have to at least like pay attention. You're a lot more at threat and a lot more squishy than this build is. So it remains a great way to push high tier content. And even more so with this unique, spreading Bone Storm out and generating the big shields through Shielding Storm. I strongly recommend you try the build. It might not hit as hard as Bone Spear, but it is a lot smoother and calmer to play, honestly. For now then, I've been Hollow, you've been you. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.